So you've seen the video for John, just continuing on with John. Well, we've already done authorship and all that, kind of lost our place on the PowerPoints here. And you saw the video. So now, again, we've looked at this chart every single week. So again, you will see this chart on the final. So, looking at this chart, we see John is now totally different than the other Gospels. So in the other Gospels, we've seen they kind of are together. They have a lot of similarities, but with John, we're really seeing emphasis on Jesus being the Son of God. And that title, that's very much identifying Jesus with God, as God. So John, which is one reason liberal scholars wanted to attack the authority of John so much, John is one of those where John makes it very clear that Jesus is God. So the divinity of Jesus is there. We highlight who's the original readers? Really both, Jews and Gentiles, the church. It's a general audience made up of both Jews and Gentiles, the church. The key phrase, believe. It's this invitation for you to believe that what Jesus said about himself is true. The religious leaders didn't believe. What are you going to do? Then we see prominent sections of the teaching section. So it's not like Luke where you have the parables are the prominent sections. With Mark, it's the miracles. And with Matthew, it's those big sermons. With that big sermon. With John, it's these individual teaching sections. There's not a genealogy here, but you could argue it's an interesting birth narrative in the fact that it tells you there's no genealogy. He's from God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So, for geographic emphasis, this mainly takes place in Judea. Okay, so we've kind of glossed over this portion as we've talked through this. I've always kind of hit the last two and then just talked over it really quick. With the synoptics, so if we were looking at a picture of Israel, of Palestine, you have Galilee at the top, then you have Samaria, then you have Judea. Judea is where Jerusalem is and all that, right? And then you have Samaria, and then above that is Galilee. So Jesus grew up in Galilee. The base of operations for Jesus was along the Sea of Galilee in Capernaum. You also hear sometimes Capernaum. There, you can go there to this day, where Jesus, that was the base of operations for Jesus in Galilee. So, the Synoptic Gospels mainly tell the story of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, the region where Jesus grew up. John mainly tells the story of Jesus' ministry in Judea, near Jerusalem. You see why a lot of the stories are very different? Because they're telling about different aspects of ministry. So the synoptics are very much like, this is what he did in Galilee. He did this in Nazareth. He did this in Capernaum. He did this in this area. He goes across the Sea of Galilee. He does this. When you get to John, John is very much like, yes, he talks about those other areas as well, but for him, the focus is very much Judea. Very much focus around the major festivals that are going to happen in Judea. So, time sequence. And I'm going to have a whole section of slides where we're going to talk about chronology and timing. So I'm not going to get too much into it, but just understand when it comes to time sequence, the Synoptic Gospels, you only have one Passover mentioned. But there are 3+ Passovers mentioned in John. So it's 3 Passovers, but possibly a 4th because there's an unnamed feast. It doesn't say if it's a Passover or one of the other feasts. Okay, so let's get to some specific differences between the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels. So some of your specific differences and you have this in your textbook on page 607. Some of the specific differences, the wedding at Cana. So in that video we just watched, it talked about the wedding at Cana. That's the first sign, according to John. It's the first big miracle. Most of us know this because that's the famous part where Jesus' mother comes to him and says, hey, they're out of wine. And he says, what do y'all have to do with you, woman? It's not my time yet. And people are like, oh, he did not just say that to his mother. When he says woman like that, that was not considered insulting in his culture. In our culture, if you call your mom woman, that's insulting. In his culture, that's not. It's not, beat down, exactly. It's not an insulting way to say it. But what he was just simply saying is, God is the one that dictates when is my time. And that's important in John, because what we're going to see later, and what you saw a little bit in the video, is the signs, each of his miracles are signs pointing towards something. So that very first miracle is that's that first time Jesus is really revealing himself, and he's saying, okay, well, I'm doing this now. So next we see the encounter with Nicodemus. That's in John, but you don't see that anywhere else. John 3:16, that's in the context of the encounter with Nicodemus. The woman at the well, that's in John. That's not anywhere else. The Last Supper, now that's in John and the Synoptics. You see that in both. So that's a place where they both say that. You see the final priestly prayer. So there's a prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane in the Gospels, but in John, in the Synoptic Gospels, but in John, there's a really long prayer. That's not the Garden of Gethsemane prayer. It's really long. That prayer is in John, but it's not in the others. This whole prologue, where in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, that's John and nowhere else. So what I'm hoping that you're seeing with this is there's a lot of material that the three synoptic gospels all agree on that is nowhere to be found in John. And there's a lot of material that's in John that's nowhere to be found in the synoptic gospels. And again, that kind of suits what we were talking about earlier when I said, I think one of the indicators of what John's doing is this is much later. The synoptic gospels have already been written down. John is like, hey, I'm not going to re-say what the three of you have already said. I'm aware of those traditions. I'm not going to say that stuff again. But what I am going to do is I'm going to tell the stories that haven't been told. I know all this stuff that a lot of people don't know about, and I need to write that down so I can leave that for the next generations of Christians. There are certain things like the Last Supper that John mentions and the other Gospels mention. But there's a lot of new information that John is bringing in. Birth narratives, that's in the Gospel, that's in the Synoptics, but not in John. This concluding epilogue of John, which we might get a chance to get to, that's unique to John. So another interesting thing, John does not use parables. John does not mention parables at all. So you have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They all have parables. Parables are really important. You don't see that in John. It's a very different feel to John. Jesus and the tax collector, that's in the Synoptics, but you don't see that. Casting out demons, you don't see Jesus casting out any demons in John. And you don't see Jesus healing any lepers in John. So these are things that we think, oh, he's healing the lepers, he's casting out demons, he's dealing with tax collectors. Nowhere to be found in John. So another thing we see, looking at some of these other things in John, and you can see them, Sermon on the Mount, Jesus with the children, the talk about the end times, the emphasis on miracles. That stuff's not in John. In fact, your book, excuse me. In fact, your book has a whole section showing you the similarities between the Gospel of John the miracles in the Gospel of John and the miracles in Matthew, and you see in the Synoptics, and you see. I'm sorry. I'm gonna get some. I'm gonna get some water here in a second. I'm gonna go to the water fountain here in a second. But you see the similarities that are very much the miracle. There are a lot more miracles, and there's a lot heavier emphasis on miracles in the Synoptics, where we only see 7 major miracles, while until the resurrection. Up until the resurrection, we only see 7 major miracles in John. So, another thing that you see that's unique to John is going to be the emphasis. So he does have miracles, but the miracles are not just called miracles, they're called signs. So they emphasize something. They're like signposts pointing towards something. So that's just a different take that John has on everything.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
The only thing they have in common is the Last Supper.
No, there's actually some other things that they do have in common. If you can I see your book for a second? I think a more helpful part in your book to see some of the things that they do have in common is the section. There's a section here about miracles, and that's on page 615. Thank you, I appreciate that. On 615 and 6 what? Yeah, I appreciate that. On 615 it says so you also see the feeding of the 5,000. That's in John and the Synoptics. Walking on the sea, that's in John and the Synoptics. The miraculous catching of fish, that's in John and it's in Luke. So there are some other overlapping parts, but not as many. Not as many. So you do have some stories like the Last Supper, the feeding of the 5,000, the influence of John the Baptist on Jesus' ministry. Those are all things that we do see that are common to John, to the Gospel of John, and to the Synoptics. But there are just a lot of differences, a whole lot of differences. Which is why when you see all these similarities, it's why you get that question of, oh, this is why we make such a big deal about the Synoptics being seen together. Because they have all these stories in common, and you look at John, and you're just like, oh my goodness. If it wasn't for these 5 or 6 stories, you'd think he's talking about a different person. But again, he's focusing in on a totally different part of Jesus' ministry. Totally different part. So he emphasizes different things. So let's look at some of the critical issues here. The order of John. Is John in chronological order? So that we're going to deal with that. Next one is the 7 signs. We're going to talk about the 7 signs. Then we'll get to the I am statements, and then we'll finish that up with the repetition of the number 7 in John. So the order of John. A big question about the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels. I didn't really deal with that. I saved it until we got to John. But this is just as much a critical issue with the Synoptic Gospel as it is with John. But it really starts to pop when you see John. And that is John in chronological order? Or is it in thematic or theological order? So what do I mean by that? Chronological order just means, is it done in the sense of time? Is it organized based on time? So it's like doing a timeline. Jesus did this, then he did this, then he did this. And I'm ordering it based on time. So when something is in chronological order, we're confident that if something happens closer to the beginning, then that means that in the time of Jesus' life, it happened before something that happens near the middle. Something that happens near the middle in timing of Jesus' life happened before something that happened near the end. That's chronology. So that's how we mainly do history nowadays. When we tell a story about someone, we start with the beginning of their life and we end with the end of their life. But that's not the only way to tell a story about someone's life. Even though it's the most common way we use today, you can also tell the story of someone's life thematically, or in Jesus' case, theologically. When I say theologically or thematically, what I mean is John organizing his gospel based on theological points that need to be made, or based on themes that he's trying to get you to understand. So is he saying, okay, I want you to really understand that Jesus is God. So all of those parts are here. I really want you to understand that Jesus has a ministry of teaching. So all of those parts are here. I really want you to understand that Jesus is our Savior. So all those parts are here. Is it organized that way? Or is it organized based on time? So does that make sense? Does that concept make sense? We take for granted that you tell the story of someone's life in chronological order. But that's not the only way to do that. In fact, I've seen some biographies that actually take people's lives, like now, that are written today, that take people's lives, and they don't do a chronological order. They say, okay, this is that person's career, this is that person's ministry, this is that person's influence, this is that person's writing stuff. So they do it by theme, not in chronological order. What is really easy for us to do in the Gospels is to make some mistakes about chronological order. So there's a lot of debate. Not everyone agrees. Some people would say that John is chronological and Mark isn't. Some would say Mark is chronological and John isn't. Some would say neither are chronological. The reason I keep saying Mark, some say Mark is chronological, some say John. Mark is the first of the Synoptic Gospels, most likely. And all of the others seem to follow. The other two Synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke, generally follow the same pattern, in the same pattern of what happens when, the same order. Luke changes the order up a little bit from Matthew and Mark, but not much. So the synoptics generally follow the order of Mark, with some exceptions in Luke. So, why is this important? Why am I going to spend 3 slides talking about chronology? So, how long was Jesus' ministry? 3 years. Why do you know? How do you know that? The festivals. Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't say anything about that. Right. So that's really important, right? We say that his ministry is 2 to 3 years, and that's based on this idea that John has 3 Passovers and a 4th festival that could be a Passover. So that's 3 Passovers, which at minimum means you have 1 year to the next year. That's 1 year. Passover to Passover, that's 1 year. And then Passover to Passover, that's 2 years. At a minimum, you don't know if his ministry started, how many months before that Passover his ministry started, and you don't know if this other festival. So 2 to 3 years is a general based on John. But what if John is not chronological, but it's thematic? And he mentions 3 Passovers, but they're the same Passovers. I don't think that's the case, but you see why that matters. What if Matthew, Mark, and Luke just mentioning the one Passover is right and Jesus' ministry only lasted a year? You see why that matters? it makes sense. Now again, I think that chronology maybe isn't as important here because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their focus is on Galilee, right? So maybe they just left out the other Passovers because they weren't significant to what they were trying to emphasize. So you don't have to get the chronology thing straight to say for that one, but it really helps you to understand that. So the next thing, how many times did Jesus cleanse the temple? How many times did Jesus cleanse the temple? Was it? Where do you get that from? You said twice. Where do you get that from?
Before he was crucified, he cleansed the temple.
Before he was crucified, he cleansed the temple. But when does that, you're getting that from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When does John say he cleansed the temple?
That was early because the video had it that he cleansed the temple.
Right. So he cleansed the temple. Yeah. Early. Very beginning of his ministry. Early. So, did he cleanse the temple twice? Once at the beginning of his ministry, once at the end? Or did he cleanse it once and either the synoptics are not being chronological, they're being thematic, or they are, and John's being thematic. You see what I mean? So you see why this is important for us to talk about. Which one? Did he do it twice? Or did he do it just once, but the synoptics are trying to say they don't really care about when it happened and they just, this is what happened. Or John is not really caring about when it happened. He's just saying, hey, it happened. And he's putting it at the beginning because he's trying to tell you something theological about Jesus' ministry. Is it at the beginning because John is trying to make a theological point? Did the whole Nicodemus situation happen at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, there in chapter 3, or is he front-loading the gospel, and that's why he puts it at the beginning, and it actually happened near the end of his ministry? You right? You see why this puts us in a weird place, right? 2 cleansings, 1 cleansing. 1 year of ministry, 3 years of ministry. Which one? So, now that I've got our head spinning, so
I vote for 3.
you vote for 3 years of ministry and for two of the cleansings of the temple. Yeah. So what we do when we do that, what we do is we say both are chronological. What that position would be is 3 years and it's 2 cleansings. What we're saying generally with that is we're saying both are chronological. There's 2 cleansings. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are right. John's right. There's 2 cleansings of the temple. One at the beginning of his ministry, one at the end of his ministry. Obviously, the one at the end of his ministry, he has gone too far. Now they're actually going to try to kill him. So that is us saying both. That's that answer. Okay, so otherwise there's just one, and then you have to pick who's right. Is it John who's being chronological, or is it Mark who's being chronological? Okay, so in favor of the synoptics being chronological, so in favor of that, what's the evidence we have in favor of that? The synoptics seem to follow some sort of chronological order in terms of the order of Jesus, because what do we see? We see the birth, we see the ministry, we see the death, and we see the resurrection. So at some point, they have to have some sort of chronology, right? And Luke, and I actually have that written down a little bit later too, Luke actually gives you specific chronological time. Luke says, and then there's a census at the beginning when Jesus is about to be born. Mary's pregnant. There's a census When? In the year when Quirinius, in his first census as governor, when he says that, he is placing you in a chronological time frame. That's what Luke is doing. That's how they gave you a chronology. They gave you, this is the year that it started. What else does Luke do, kind of placing you in a chronology? Luke says, and when he started, he was about 30 years old when he started his ministry. Well, that seems to indicate some sort of time chronology there. Okay, so we have some things in the synoptic, especially in Luke. Now remember, Luke changes the timing of synoptic a little bit, but not much. So that seems to indicate that the synoptics are chronological. But what's the evidence against? One, early church father, a guy named Papias, we've already mentioned him once. A guy named Papias, what does he say? He claimed that Mark wrote down the stories of Peter, but not in any particular order. Okay? So, was Papias right? No. Papias is certainly not infallible, and he's just giving us a tradition that he heard. So, we don't know. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. Something to think about. Synoptics do not mention historical markers like festivals and feasts. So, St. John seems to be giving these chronological markers, because what does John do? John says, okay, and then he had this Passover, and then a little bit further, there's this Passover. A little bit further, there's this Passover. That really seems to indicate an attention to timing, right? Now, I said it could be, I was kind of messing with you a little bit, Ms. Nelda, when I said, well, it could be thematic. He's just talking about the same Passover each time. But no, he doesn't seem to be doing that, because he's giving a different story about each one. So it seems to be that there's these three different Passovers. So those things, why does the synoptics not give those? Again, the counterpoint to that would be to say what I said earlier. Well, they weren't focusing in on Judea. They didn't mention them, not because of any chronological issue, but because they didn't matter to them as much. Their focus is on Jesus' Galilean ministry. Okay, so in favor of John being chronological, John numbers the signs as if he were giving a chronological account. He says, okay, this is the first sign of Jesus. This is the second sign of Jesus. This is the third sign of Jesus. That seems to indicate on John's part a chronological focus here. Okay? The next part of that is John lists the feasts. Again, we've already mentioned that. John gives these feasts and the Passover and these feasts and festivals to kind of give you that idea. Next, what's against John being chronological? John organizes the signs and the I am statements in a way that seems thematic or theological. So I mentioned up here, he lists the signs, first, second, third, fourth. But how many does he mention? 7. And we're going to come back to the fact that he loves to use the number 7. He gives 7 signs. We know that Jesus did more than 7 miracles, right? Those miracles, he gives 7 because these 7 are significant for theological and thematic reasons. There's a theme he's trying to make. There's a point he's trying to make. So, you could argue that those 7 signs point to, okay, these 7 signs point to a chronology. It's the first, it's the second, it's the third, but you could just as easily argue, yeah, but obviously he did more than 7. The 7 signs are more about him making a theological point. 7's the number of completion. It's God completed his work on the earth on the 7th day. What's the 8th miracle that we see? The resurrection. It's a rebirth. It's this, at the seventh day he rested, he completed creation. Well, now we see Jesus, the eighth miracle in John. There's a sign that is not mentioned in the same way. This resurrection. Look at what he does. So, what's that? You thought I was going to give you some answers here, but apparently I'm just going to confuse you even more, right? So, there's another option, and this is where I lean, I'll say. John and the Synoptics could both use a combination of chronological and thematic ordering. So we emphasize today the importance of chronological thing. Like I said, some scholars will still do a biography of somebody's life thematically, or topically. But 9 times out of 10, we have this obsession with doing things in chronological order. But ancient authors, it didn't bother them as much. They may generally keep a chronological order, but then deviate from the chronological order in order to make a point. So there is a possibility, and I lean this way, that the broad strokes of both the Synoptics and John are chronological. Especially Luke seems to be trying to keep some kind of chronology. John also seems to be keeping some sort of chronology. Both have the beginning of Jesus' ministry with John the Baptist. The Synoptics and the Gospel of John both have, it starts with the ministry of John the Baptist. Both have a move towards Jerusalem with the ending in Jerusalem with the resurrection after that. So they all have these broad chronological strokes. So it is possible that you have a general attention to chronology with willingness to deviate when necessary to make a theological point. That still leaves you with a little bit of uncertainty about the cleansing of the temple, though. Is this one of those places where John deviated to make a point? We don't know. The reality is we don't know. I think that as believers, as devoted believers, it doesn't hurt for us to just say, since we don't know, let's err on the side of saying there were two. Better to err on the side of saying that there was one at the beginning and there was one at the end. And here's why. Because John seems to put it at the beginning for a reason. It seems to be very important for John that it's at the beginning of his ministry, but it also seems to be very important for the Synoptics that it's at the end of his ministry. So I think it's safe to just go ahead and say it happened twice. To go with what you were saying and just to say, I like 3 years. It was his ministry. There were three Passovers, and it was two, and there were two of 3 years of ministry, and there were two of the cleansings. Look, it doesn't hurt for us to say, look, we're not 100% sure, so let's just err on the side of caution and say there were two. So, does that make sense? There are no firm answers, but also understand that they do not do, the Gospels are not like we do history. They're trying to give an orderly account of Jesus' life, but they're also trying to make a theological point. So if they need to change up the chronology in order to make a theological point, that's fine. That doesn't make their story any less accurate. They never told you they were given a chronological report anyway. So it doesn't make it less accurate because they weren't trying to make a chronological report. Not totally, at least.
So when he was away when they came to tell him that Lazarus was sick, and Thomas said he would go with him to death because they didn't want to go back to Jerusalem. Was that the cleansing that he had? Because that's why they didn't want to.
Right. So what you have with the Lazarus account. So Lazarus. So he doesn't. They find out that Lazarus is sick. He doesn't want to go. Thomas doesn't want to go because he's like, oh, they're just going to kill us. And then Jesus makes a whole comment about there's all this time in the day. Basically, you can walk at night and it's going to be fine. And then we know that it was him raising Lazarus that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and then the leaders really started to plot to kill him. So, an interesting thing that you see with John is John, if you take it chronologically, John kind of gives you this indication that Jesus was slowly irritating the religious leaders in Jerusalem. He kind of gives you this thing where he irritates them at the beginning of his ministry, and then as his ministry goes on, they just get madder and madder and madder and madder.
I heard that the reason he hesitated or waited, well, it could be another reason he hesitated to raise Lazarus, was because that the Jews believed that a spirit hangs around for a certain number of days, and he intentionally waited to prove that he had power over.
Yeah, yeah, that's the question more in terms of like, why did he wait 4 days?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a possibility of there's this belief going on at the time that he waited 4 days because of the death, because of the spirit hanging around for a while. That may or may not be the case, but there's a much simpler explanation as well. You wait 4 days, it proves that he was actually dead.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Mhm.
This is not, he fell asleep, because it wasn't unusual in this day and age for you to think someone died, but they're not actually dead. So in this case, what you have is he's clearly dead. How do we know? He's waited 4 days. There's no question about that. They roll the stone away, and what is it? Oh, he's going to stink. There's even a mentioning of the stench at this point. So he is clearly dead. No doubt that he's dead. And then Jesus is going to basically do what they don't expect and brings it back to life. But so yeah, you have a clear waiting. There's no getting it twisted. The religious leaders cannot paint this any other way. So back to chronology here in terms of what's happening. With John's chronology, you get this picture, with the way John does it, you get this picture of he started to irritate the people in Jerusalem at the very beginning, and then as you go in, they just get more and more and more irritated, and then he gets to the end of his ministry, and this guy's got to go. This guy's got to go. With the synoptics, because their focus is more in Galilee, you don't see a bunch of visits to Jerusalem. You have a couple of places where people from Jerusalem come down to see what's going on with Jesus. So you in the synoptics, it's very much this picture of Jesus doing this thing. He keeps coming in contact and getting into arguments with local religious leaders, but not into a lot of stuff, but only a little bit of stuff in with these Jerusalem leaders. And it's not until the end the Jerusalem leaders are really big. So if you take those two together, and you take the chronology of the course of events of the synoptics, and you merge those with John, you really do have this much fuller picture of most of Jesus' ministry is taking place in the Galilee area. with some other areas as well. But he has routine visits every time Passover comes around to Jerusalem. And every time you have a Passover visit, he gets in Judea. He gets in the area of Judea, because he's not actually in Jerusalem when he raises Lazarus. He's close, but he's not actually in Jerusalem. He just gets a madder and madder and madder. And then now it's going to come to the final showdown. So yeah, it does help to kind of look at those together. So let's go to the 7. So let's move on from that. Any questions about chronology? Any more questions about that? Have we beat the dead horse? Okay, good. So, I am statements. So that we have the 7 I am statements from him. So what I want you to see is when we think of, and I'll come back to that slide I just showed you. When we think of I am statements, he's going to say statements like, wait a second. I'm using, my slides are I got my slides in the wrong order. Hold on. 7 I am statements. And then instead of I am statements, I gave you the 7 signs. All right, I got my stuff all out of order, y'all.
Can't be on the test then.
Yeah, we'll still get it on the test. Yeah, don't worry about that. So instead of 7 I am, just ignore what this says right here. Let's just talk about the 7 signs, okay? The 7 signs in John, there are 7 signs, so 7 miracles. He doesn't tend to call them miracles, he calls them signs, because they're not just, the point of these 7 signs are not just about healing somebody or doing this thing. They're specifically focused in on, they are revealing who Jesus is, that Jesus is truly the Son of God. They were revealing this to the people. So these 7 signs in John, you'll need to know probably at least 2 of these, be able to tell me what some of the signs are. The first sign, we see the changing of water into wine. And then we see the central truth of that points to Jesus as the source of all blessings in God's future. So again, it gets to the we talk about the wedding feast of the Lamb. We talk about one day we'll be with God and it'll be like this feast. It's a picture of it's like a signpost pointing you to what's coming. He heals the official son. It's pointing to Jesus as the life giver. It's a sign. He's the life giver. And these are all signposts showing you this is the Son of God. Next, you see the healing of the invalid guy at the pool of Bethesda. It points to Jesus as his Father's co-worker. We see the feeding of the 5,000. Points to Jesus as life-giving bread from heaven. We see walking on water. It points to Jesus as the divine I am. We'll get to that I am terminology in a second. Number 6, we see the healing of a man that was born blind. It points to Jesus as a giver of spiritual sight. And then last, we see the raising of Lazarus that points to Jesus' resurrection and him as the resurrection and the life. Because just as he's going to raise Lazarus, and like the video said, Jesus knows that this is that straw that broke the camel's back. In fact, Thomas knows, because what does Thomas say? If we go there, we're going to get killed. He knows that this is it. If he shows himself, these people are already so mad at him. If he shows himself in that area, they're gonna start plotting to kill him. So
did you say earlier that Thomas didn't want to go with him?
Thomas doesn't want to go. If you look at that passage in 11, chapter 11, so they're walking around, They find out that they find out that Lazarus is sick and is going to die. So Jesus says, this is not unto death, and we're going to keep going. And then they go for a little bit, and then they find out that he dies, and then Jesus says he's asleep, and they're like, oh, well, he's fine then. He's like, ugh. But then he's like, no, we're going. And then Thomas makes this statement, and Thomas is like, oh, great, so we can die with him.
Oh, that's what they mean.
Yeah,
But
so
then here it
Thomas,
says, let us all go that we may die with him.
let us all go that we may die with him. Yes, that is Thomas saying they're going to kill us. Thomas, you don't just say, oh, let's go so we can die with him. Like, that's not just a jokey, sarcastic statement. This is an exasperation of, you know what this is about to lead to. And then John's next statement, since you're there, go ahead and read the next statement, what Jesus says. What does Jesus say?
Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already.
Can I
You
see
say the
it?
11th chapter?
Right after what Thomas says.
Thomas said this, right?
We just didn't listen to his fellow believers.
Yeah.
16.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, then 17th, then Jesus said.
Yeah, so verse 10, so 9, looking at 8, it says, and then the disciples say to him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again? So that's actually before what Thomas says. But it does give you context for what Thomas says. Right before this, they're saying, hey, Master, don't you realize that they're seeking to kill you, and then you want to go there? And then Jesus says in verse 9, are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. But if a man walketh at night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him. And these things he said, after they saith unto him, our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go, and I may wake him, that I may wake him. So what Jesus basically says when they says, hey, don't you realize that they're going to try to kill us if we go? Jesus says, in layman's terms, Jesus says, we're going to go at night, guys. What are you talking about? He said, don't you know there's 12 hours in the day, and then when someone walks at night, they stumble? He's saying we're going to go at night. Basically, we're going to travel there at night so that we're safe until we get there. So, and that's when he's like, yeah, let's go with them, because, that way we can die with them too. So, these signs, like for the test, I want you to pay attention to these. I'm not going to ask you to know the central truth off the top of your head, but you need to know at least some of these signs. What are some of the 7 signs that John mentioned? Okay, so moving on to the I am statements. So looking at these I am statements, we see 7 I am. We had 7 signs. We have 7 I am statements. Again, there were also at the very beginning, there were 7, video talked about this, there were 7 things that they called Jesus. We're seeing this recurring number, right? 7. So there's 7 I am statements. Now, when we think of I am, it's just common. I'm going to the bathroom. I'm going to teach tonight. I'm going to get in my car and go home. To the point where we don't even say I am, we just say I'm, right? We just go ahead and get that contraction, I apostrophe. I don't have time to pronounce that A. So it's a routine thing. I am. Man, I am tired of him talking about chronology. Goodness. Let's move on to something else. I am. So why is this a big deal? Why do we emphasize these 7 I am statements? You have to understand that in the Old Testament, the specific title I am is how God refers to himself in Exodus chapter 3. And I put the passage here. Exodus chapter 3. Moses asks God, you're going to send me. Who am I going to tell them sent me? Moses is trying to get out of having to go to Egypt to get people, to set people, God's people free. He's trying to get out of it, and he says, who am I going to tell them sent me? And what does God tell him? He says, and God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus. So God's saying this, you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am sent you. So, now, John is writing in Greek. John is writing in Greek. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Okay? Jesus is most likely speaking in Aramaic. Most likely. So, when John is writing, John is trying to help you to understand what Jesus is saying. Now, there's a common translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint. That is the Greek translation accepted by the Jews, used by the Jews. That is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. In that Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, it uses a very specific way of saying I am. It's not just your typical I am, because there's one word that you need to use to say I am. I'm not going to give you a Greek lesson, but there's one word that you need to say I am. But there's a way that you can add something else to that word that makes it emphatic, like I am sent you. When John writes in Greek, what Jesus says, he uses the exact same phrasing that God used in the Septuagint version of this passage. So what John is trying to get you to understand is that when Jesus says things like, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the gate for the sheep, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the true vine, I am a king. He is using God's divine name, I am sent you. These are not just statements of, oh, I am these things, because there's a different way he could have said that in the Greek language. Again, in English, it looks the same both ways. So most of your Bibles will try to capitalize it to show you he's trying to emphasize something here. So notice there's some cases in John where Jesus will say, I am this. And when he says this, they pick up stones, they're ready to kill him. Because they know what he's saying. So these I am statements are Jesus calling himself God. So that's an important thing. So when I ask you on the test about this, when I say what's the significance of the I am statements, what I really want is that summary. I want you to show me when Jesus said I am, he was calling himself God. That's what I really want. I don't need you to give me this whole I am seems like a common phrase, but yeah, that's not what I need. What I really want you to show is that he's calling himself God. Who sent you? I am sent me. So, number 7. Man, he loves number 7, right? It repeats you see these 7 different names. You see these 7 I am statements. You see these 7 signs. And really, it's an important thing that he's weaving through. Creation took place in how many days? 7 days. it's the number of completion. It's a significant number. Now, does John mean it in any different ways? Maybe. I don't want to get bogged down too much in biblical numerology because it gets kind of, it just starts to become a bunch of people's opinions that really don't have as much validity. But it does tend to be in the Bible the number of completions. That might be what he's going for here. But it is a significant number. So if I ask you a question on the test, what number is significant in the Gospel of John? 7. Okay. So we're going to do the same thing we did last week. We don't have time to watch that video, so the Bible Project video. Just Google Bible Project John Part 2. Or you just go to YouTube and type in on YouTube Bible Project John Part 2, and it'll come up. Or Gospel of John Part 2, and it'll come up. So, some notable passages. Notable passages here are, I don't have time to go into these passages, but passages I would encourage you to read and to look at. We've already kind of gone through some passages, just talking about Lazarus and others. But Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 14, that is your prologue when he first introduces the book. That's the big place where he tells you, hey, this is the Word. The Word was from the beginning. God always, Jesus always has been and always will be. He is God in human form. So John 4, that's the Samaritan woman. John's Samaritan woman is important because what do we see Jesus doing? Jesus is going to a people group that is hated by the Jews. John 7:53 through 8:10, that's the woman caught in adultery. Now, that is a passage that we really need to be able to talk more about if we're going to talk about it at all, because there's a couple of things related to that passage. But John 15 is just where he gives the vine. God is the vine. And then John 21 is where he talks about, where John 15 is where he says, I'm the vine, God is the vine dresser. John 21. So just a quick word about that. At the end of John, after Jesus has resurrected, you see this weird kind of extra story where the disciples, in this 40-day period where Jesus is resurrected, the disciples go back to fishing. And it's just kind of tacked in there. You're like, what's going on there? It's after the resurrection. You think they should be out doing the Great Commission or something right now. But we actually do know it's not that strange when you take Acts into consideration. And what does Acts say? Acts says that it was the Holy Spirit hasn't come yet, and Acts says there's this long period of time between the period of the resurrection and the Pentecost. Pentecost is 50 days after the Passover, by the way. So there's this period of around 40 days where Jesus is resurrected and he's making all these appearances. So apparently in that time you have some sort of the disciples don't really know what to do, and I'm going to what I know, I'm going to fish. And you see Jesus doing this miracle that clearly is from him. And he's on the shore and they don't recognize him, and he's like, throw your net out, which by the way is a miracle that Luke records also early on in Jesus' ministry that he does. So again, when we talk about chronology, it seems like this has occurred at two different points. One at the beginning of Jesus' ministry when he first called them, and then once at the end when they're starting to get kind of off the path after he's resurrected. An important thing to mention in this passage is we see Jesus redeeming Peter. Again, we see Jesus. How many times does Peter deny Jesus? 3 times. And we don't just see that in the Synoptics, we see that in John. So how many times do we see Jesus affirming Peter? 3 times. I want to say Peter denying Jesus is in the Synoptics, but I'm second guessing myself now. I'm pretty sure it's in all. But yeah. So just we ran through those passages really quick. I wanted us to kind of dive into them, but you don't always get that. So next week we'll have the test. If you have any questions about the test, let me know this week. So any questions about this before we close?
We have it, we're gonna get the quiz back for tonight for this.
Yeah, I can go ahead and grade the quizzes for tonight and give them to you. I can do that. For most of them, I just got to write them down because I was already grading them. So yeah. So y'all have a good week. I'll write down these quizzes real quick so you can have your grade.